So the first article I selected comes from George Koo, and it deals with early data from the NESI. I felt like this was an important resource to include today because it was foundational in our early understanding of what NESI could provide to schools and colleges. The article, titled What We're Learning About College Student Engagement from NESI, was published in 2003, and it includes data from the first 3 years of NESI administration. This includes over 600 colleges and 285,000 first-year and senior-level students. In it, Koo describes 19 educationally purposeful activities that have been grouped into 5 benchmarks of engagement. The 5 benchmarks include level of academic challenge, for example, working harder than you thought you could to meet an instructor's standards, active and collaborative learning, for example, working with classmates outside of class or on a project or an assignment. Student-faculty interaction, which could be discussing career plans with a faculty member or working on a committee with a faculty member. And then enriching educational experiences could include service learning, study abroad. And then the 5th one is a supportive campus environment, which could include something as simple as receiving prompt feedback on assignments. Some interesting findings came out of this initial review of the data. First of all, the size of the college matters. In general, it was found that smaller schools tended to have more engaged students than larger schools. The important thing to note here, however, is that Koo points out that engagement differs more within a school than between schools. In terms of individuals, women, full-time students, or those who live on campus, Native students, international students, students who have experienced diversity and or participated in a learning community tended to be the most engaged. Again, there's a lot of variability within each of these groups, so we should be careful not to generalize this too much. Interestingly, Koo noted no racial differences in level of engagement, but when asked about their grades, white students reported higher grades than did ethnic minority students. Since GPA is correlated with all of the NESI benchmarks, this is a little bit counterintuitive. It may be due to the fact that GPA is self-reported and NESI doesn't directly assess learning. One issue with the NESI that Koo notes, and I find an important point to bring to the table, is that the NESI simply asks students about the presence or absence of each item and has no real way of identifying if the engagement practices are done well or not. For example, a student can say that they did a collaborative project with a classmate, but we don't know what kind of project it was, how intensive it was, whether it required research or not, whether it was a collaboration with one student or more than one student. And so the details of these assignments are lacking, and so we have to be very careful in the extent to which we apply this information. In addition to being foundational knowledge, the other reason I picked this article is because it directly addresses engagement of transfer students. There's a whole section in the article on transfer students. And depending on the institution type, between 40% to 70% of NESI respondents identified themselves as having started their career at a college different from the one in which they're going to graduate, which was how NESI defined transfer students. It's nice to note that these students report being just as academically engaged, and they report comparable grades to their non-transfer peers. Keep in mind, academic engagement or academic challenge is one of the 5 benchmarks. Interestingly, on the other 4 benchmarks, transfer students reported significantly lower levels of engagement compared with non-transfer students. Now, one of the reasons why I find that interesting is because I read another article by Lester, Leonard, and Matthias that might partially illuminate this data that came from the NESI. So I picked the Lester, Leonard, and Matthias article separate from picking the NESI article, but it turns out they worked really nicely together. I picked the second article because the population being studied was specifically meant to be transfer students, and also because this was a qualitative study, which was one of the requirements, was that I pick one study that was qualitative, and I think Dr. Ryder made me do that because he knows qualitative is not my comfort zone. Anyway, the article that I chose was entitled Transfer Student Engagement, Blurring of Social and Academic Engagement in 2013. Their cross-sectional study was done at George Mason University and involved 31 45-minute interviews. 31 participants had one 45-minute interview each. And it crossed students across all 4 years of school. So they had some first-year students, some sophomores, juniors, and seniors included in the sample. Now, George Mason University is a pretty big school with 30,000 students, and of that, about 10% or 3,000 are transfer students. And so, again, the 31 that they interviewed is a very small number, but relatively representative of the transfer population at that school. Interview questions covered educational experiences and academic preparation prior to their current enrollment. So that might have been either their test scores or whatever schooling they had at their previous institution. Questions about transition from one school to the next, sort of how that went, what the problems were, what the concerns were, and then perceptions of academic and social engagement. Now, the authors stated that they intentionally targeted a population of students who were A, likely to be engaged, and B, supposedly academically successful. But they didn't report any data on their academic success. So there was a whole table that spanned 2 pages in the article of demographic data looking at, did their parents go to college, did they live on campus or off campus, and a variety of different things. But nowhere in there did they report GPA, even, for example. And so we have to kind of take it on faith that these were actually academically successful students, because there was no way for us to put that into context. And that might be due to the fact that there's different interpretations of academic success as well. Nonetheless, the data from their interviews yielded some interesting trends that map onto Kuh's data quite nicely. So one of the things is that students define social engagement as interacting with people and agencies outside of the campus community. For example, their church or their local homeless shelter or their family. A lot of students talked about support from children or support from spouses or support from parents. And a theme that was kind of across the board was students did not find on-campus social activities to be relevant to themselves or to their education. And this may be due to the fact that they're very different, which we talked about in question number 1. But they did find alternate areas of social engagement that were supportive of their educational goals. What seemed to be a more important feature for these transfer students were the academic challenges within the classroom setting. And so you can see quickly how this maps onto Kuh's engagement benchmarks, because the one where he found a significant difference the one where he didn't find a significant difference was level of academic challenge. And so transfer students are just as academically challenged, and from Lester, Leonard, and Matthias's data, they find that to be sufficient in many cases. With regard to the other 4 benchmarks, those are really things that are separate from engagement in the classroom, and that's where in this qualitative report, Lester, Leonard, and Matthias found students sort of disregarding that or finding it. Even one student used the term distracting, found it distracting. And so one of the things I will note is that the authors of this study did look at students who transferred in from 2-year versus 4-year schools. And interestingly, they found no differences. So a little bit ago, I said there's not a lot of data in the literature about 4-year to 4-year transfers, and that seems to be the case, especially within this high-impact practice student engagement kind of a area. But this study did actually look at that and found that the way in which the students responded was similar between those 2 groups, so they didn't report any differences there. Interestingly, and I found this to be a little bit of a concern, they reported 3 different varieties of questions. So academic preparedness, things that happened prior to their current enrollment, their transition experiences, and then finally their perceptions of social and academic engagement. throughout the report, and I read it several times, so I don't think that I overlooked anything, they only reported issues surrounding academic and social engagement and how those two, the lines between those two seem to be blurred. So readers are sort of left to interpret the meaning of this oversight. Was there nothing important mentioned in those as a response to those questions, or what? Another thing to note is that although this study didn't directly assess high-impact practices, the students who were interviewed did mention many activities that would be labeled as such in their conversations about academic engagement. For example, they mentioned writing multiple drafts of a paper, doing presentations, studying abroad, things of that nature. And so it's a little bit different in terms of the focus, looking at academic and social engagement without a specific emphasis on high-impact practices, but it certainly was mentioned in the process. The third study I reviewed was different again in the sense that it was a longitudinal study. And this one does specifically look at high-impact practices. This was a study conducted by Kilgo, Sheets, and Pascarella, and it used data from the Wabash National Study of Liberal Arts Education. And this one had a little bit of a different emphasis because in the last study they talked about transfer students specifically, but not high-impact practices. This one talks about high-impact practices very generally, and transfer students weren't mentioned. But it does give us some information that furthers our understanding of high-impact practices over time, and that's why I thought it was important for us to look at. And this study included a ton of data because it came from that broader national study. It was done in a pre-test, post-test design that included, at least initially, over 4,000 students from 17 different schools who participated. And I say initially because they had, as we always do, a pretty big attrition rate. So what happened in the study was participants completed a series of instruments, including a pre-college survey that assessed background characteristics of students, followed by a battery of cognitive and personal development instruments that were chosen for the Wabash National Study. There was a preliminary pretest done 1 year later, followed by the true post-test, which was done at the end of their 4th year of college. Because of subject attrition, the number of usable participants was reduced to under 2,000, and they reported several different numbers depending upon the survey instrument, because some subjects filled out one survey and different subjects filled out a different survey, and so there were several different numbers, but it was all under 2,000, so over 50% attrition rate. And that's even though participants were paid $50 for each data collection attempt. So when they came in for the pre-test, they were paid $50. When they came in for the post-test, they were paid another $50. And still they had a pretty significant attrition rate, which that can be attributed to lack of interest in the study, but it could also be attributed to students who stop out, drop out, transfer, things of that nature as well. Okay, so high-impact practices that were of interest in this study included first-year seminar, learning communities, undergraduate research, study abroad, service learning, internships, writing intensive courses, active and collaborative learning, and capstone courses or capstone experiences. So those were considered the independent variables, and then the dependent measures were critical thinking, moral reasoning, lifelong learning, intercultural effectiveness, and socially responsible leadership. And those were the things that were measured by the variety of different surveys. The authors reported psychometric data for all of their instruments and did a number of tests for multicollinearity to ensure the validity of their regression model. So that was pretty impressive. I got kind of bogged down in the numbers for a while. Internal consistency, reliability numbers, and correlation matrices of a variety of sorts. But in the end, the regression model showed that active and collaborative learning and undergraduate research were the two biggest predictors of the 4th year outcomes. Additionally, all of the dependent measures that they looked at were positively influenced by at least one high-impact practice, except for one. Moral reasoning didn't seem to be affected by